today's topic is on anxiety. I feel like, a topic everyone can probably relate to at some point in their life or day. um, so I wanted to start off by asking you guys, how do you know when you're anxious? As in, how do you know based on, does it feel a certain way? How does your body feel? Think about it. And then when you're ready to share, let me know. Go ahead, Lauren.
Okay, I was on mute. I didn't realize.
I saw that.
So I feel like personally, my heart starts to race. I sometimes when I get really like nervous and like anxiety filled and like worked up, my hands sweat. And I just start overthinking everything. Like, so my mind's racing too.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like it usually comes out in a form of like overdoing things, like doing tasks to like insanity. Like I have to have everything clean and orderly, and it's almost just kind of like a mechanism to get it off, or like, I'm trying to figure something out in a way that I'm like venting, but it's like doing tasks.
Yeah. How does it feel internally though?
Like everything's like boiling up all of a sudden, and like, I don't know, I definitely have those overwhelmed like thoughts, and it's just like my thoughts are racing, so like I don't say anything or like vocalize it, but instead I'm just like trying to outwardly without communicating.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was listening to, actually, I think Brene Brown said it most recent or first, and then I think someone else I follow was talking about it. But there's like two different types of people when they're feeling a certain type of way, and it's the overdoers and the underdoers. And so like the overdoers, like, I gotta do all this stuff, I gotta clean and like organize or whatever, and they have to control everything ultimately. And then there's the underdoers or underfunctioners basically, who are like, I'm so overwhelmed, like I just can't handle any of this. And so they're the opposite end of the spectrum. And I think she talked about it on her have you guys watched her Netflix show?
No, but I've heard a lot of good things, so I need to.
Definitely worth watching. But she talks about at one point, she's like, I used to think underfunctioners were so lazy, and I'm like, oh my god, like who does that, and then she's like, I just realized that I just didn't understand it because I was the opposite. And then there's just two ways people deal with it, and there's no right or wrong way. It's just what your natural instinct is ultimately. All right, so Kirsten, my challenge for you would be to, when you feel anxious next, pay attention to how it feels more.
Yeah.
So then you can kind of define it a little bit more specifically. So like Lauren said, heart racing, sweaty palms, racing head. And the way I tend to describe it is like, I feel like I'm up here, like from here up. Like I don't live down in my body when I'm feeling anxious. It's almost like I'm hovering above everything, like, oh my god, what's happening?
Right.
And I'm on a hamster wheel in my brain, and so I'm just like thought after thought, not really productive whatsoever, and it doesn't help. But it's like the natural instinct for a lot of people is to go to their heads thinking like, I can solve this, I can figure this out, I can navigate my way out of this feeling somehow, when in reality, of course, we know that never happens, unfortunately. But tapping into how different feelings feel, and I think it's kind of challenging, especially if you're not used to being a feeler or deeming it something that's appropriate, if you will. So when I was younger, I'm like, oh, no, feelings, just no, and I like pushed them all away. And so I had to, or still am, relearning how things feel. Like, what am I feeling in this moment? Is it truly this feeling that's basic? Like, let's say, you can label like 5 different feelings: anxious, sad, happy, mad, a couple others, I'm sure. But there's so many other ones in between those main ones. There's, I don't know, I think she said at least 30 different words for different emotions. It's like, what? I know 5. But the first step is recognizing when, or really how one feels. So when you're sad about something versus lonely, is there a difference internally? And so by practicing going inward and feeling what the feeling feels like, you can start to define what the feeling actually is from the sensation it's bringing you. So it's like kind of both. Like shame, for example, I don't know about you guys, when I'm in shame, like my face feels really hot. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that I don't recognize, but that's the one thing I know for sure. But anytime you're in an emotion, it's like, how do I feel? How does this feel? Because also when you're thinking about how you're feeling, you're going back down. Like it forces you back into the body to pay attention to, how am I feeling? Like, is my stomach in knots, or do I feel like my chest is like really tight, or does my throat feel tight or restricted? And everyone's sensations probably are a little bit different. I'm sure there's very common sensations between certain emotions. But I would say that's the first step, is kind of getting acquainted with your emotions and trying to label how each one feels. So that way, when you feel that sensation, you're like, oh, that's right, this is anxiety versus this is fear. They feel different, so now I want you to think about something that tends to trigger your anxiety, or something that you find you're anxious about right now or have been recently, and then write it down. You guys have something written down?
Yeah.
Okay. Lauren, do you want to share yours?
I'd love to.
Why not?
So I'm a huge people pleaser. And it like gives me anxiety to not give in to just please them. So telling someone no, like I don't want to, if someone asks me to like hang out or like do something that day and I really don't want to, but I know that they're going to be upset if I don't. So telling them no.
You assume they'll be upset if you say no anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
You don't fully know because you're not
I
them.
know.
But it feels like it will for sure be that way.
Yes, exactly.
Kirsten?
Yeah, I mean, mine is kind of along the same lines. Like, I am definitely like a peacemaker, people pleaser. So I put conflict. Like, if there's any conflict between like friend groups, or if like there's any confrontation at all or anything like that, I mean, it's like immediate anxiety and worry. Even if I'm not even involved, it's like I just want everything to be like great all the time, and it's not always like that. So yeah.
What comes to mind when there is conflict? Like what are you anxious about happening, I guess, if you could
That's a good
pinpoint
question.
it.
I feel like I never even think about that. Like, it's not even like, you're right. Like, there's no tangible result that could be that terrible or like earth shattering. But
Well, logically anyway.
yeah,
You know. But
yeah,
I guess like emotions are more based on past traumas, whether it's insignificant in comparison to something severe, it's still a trauma. Like everyone has trauma when you are young, and through college potentially, but those create those stories that keep you safe. And so when you're feeling anxious in conflict, it feels unsafe, right? It's like,
yeah.
oh my God, this isn't good, whatever's happening here. And if you're really interested to see have you ever looked into the Enneagram?
Yeah, I'm a type 9, like through and through. Are
Me
you
too.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
As soon as you said peacemaker and you don't
Yeah.
like conflict, I was like, I know
Yeah.
what she is.
Type 9 through and through, like 100%.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, this feels unsafe. And I'm trying to think of like, so it's different. So it's very situational for me. So conflict feels unsafe because of what might happen, I guess,
Mhm.
or how I'm perceiving conflict, let's say between me and my husband. Like I'm taking it the wrong way.
Yeah.
Or I'm entering shame because I feel like I'm a disappointment or I'm disappointing him, which feels really hard for me.
Mhm.
But that's my trauma, like that's
Yeah.
the stuff I have to work through. But that's, I guess, anxiety for some, not necessarily anxiety for me.
Yeah.
But for you, it would be looking deeper into why does this cause anxiety for me? Is there something I just haven't looked at?
Yeah.
And we'll kind of dive a little bit farther into that because I want you guys to keep these ideas at the forefront of your mind as we progress through the next section. And then I'll kind of help you dive into each section with your, I was going to say problem, but with your anxious trigger, if you will.
Yeah.
So I've had this explained to me 3 years ago. So I told you guys through email, I guess, what my huge, terrible night, I had a huge panic attack. And I had all this anxiety, and I don't think I was an anxious person. Like I do have memories of anxious moments, but my middle sister is the anxious one. I'm not the anxious one, but everyone has their time where the curated perfect life that you create is not your life, if that makes sense. And I think I was coming to a point where I was facing that, and all this anxiety boiled up because I realized that I had to take risk and do these things in order to be a better person, to take that step into marrying someone and progressing my life, if you will. And it felt really scary, which probably led to a panic attack. And so I had all these intrusive thoughts. I had obviously mind racing all the time. And it feels really real, so like any thoughts you have feel like the truth. And so it can be really challenging to dissect like what's factual and what's just the way you've been programmed to think for so long, if that makes sense. So I luckily found a course by this woman who does a lot of anxiety work. It was a very specific course on relationship anxiety, but she does courses for new moms to be or whatever. She started with people getting married. Like that was her niche at first. And then she branched out. Now she does like a bigger general anxiety course, but it all comes back to the same stuff. It doesn't really matter what the topic is, it's still anxiety. And once I understood that the emotion isn't hanging its hat on a specific topic because there's something wrong with the topic. It's hanging its hat because there's shit that's going on I need to deal with. It has nothing to do with the situation it's focusing on. So, for example, with Lauren, it's like if she was to feel anxious every time, I don't know if this is a great example because I know mine was a great example, but it's like, let's say you're anxious around a relationship in general, like a friendship, whatever. And you're like, why do I always feel anxious? Maybe this isn't a great friendship for me, but maybe it's alerting you to something else. Maybe it's telling you, well, if you set better boundaries, you wouldn't feel this way all the time around her or him or whatever. So it's always something deeper. And so that's what we're going to dive into. She explained it really well and broke it down into, you kind of have 4 realms. And so when you're feeling anxious, it's because you're not dealing with something. And the goal here is to kind of take inventory over your realms and see, where am I kind of missing the mark here, or where am I not supporting myself, as anxiety is kind of like that distress flare. It's alerting you, hey, something's wrong, not the thing it's like shooting at, but the fact that there's something underneath where the emotion is coming from. And so if you could imagine kind of like a circle in the middle, actually we can kind of do it this way. So if you have a piece of paper, you're going to probably use all of it. And think of a circle in the middle, a smaller one, doesn't have to be large. And then you're going to put 4 circles kind of in each. Actually, I should have just done this with you guys. This would have been easier. Fold your paper in half. Just loosely, it doesn't have to be hard, just so you know where the middle is. And then open it back up and make a circle that's about this big in the middle. And then you're going to put 2 circles on the top. So one on the left-hand corner, one on the right-hand corner. Yeah, that's how we'll do it. And then 2 circles on the bottom or somewhere in the middle. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're going to write around the circles. So whatever feels best. In the middle circle, you're going to write 4 realms of self. And then on the top left circle, write physical. On the top right, write emotional. The bottom left, write cognitive. And then on the bottom right, write spiritual. All right, so anytime you are feeling your distress flare of anxiety go off, you need, and especially I would say, I sense it now with the whole quarantine going on right now. I don't know if you guys are feeling kind of like low grade anxiety some days. We're like, and it's interesting because mine picks on my husband, and it's just funny because it's like, you know, it's just, it is what it is. Like it chooses that area because it's the most vulnerable thing in my life, you know, and so it's riskier, it's unsafe in comparison to being by myself. I know how to control myself. I can manage my surroundings. Other people challenge that. And so when I'm not feeling 100%, I will notice it flare up, and I notice certain things will bother me that normally don't. And so that's my cue to ask myself, okay, what's going on in this little diagram that you guys just created? And so if we're going to start at the physical section, you guys can, let's see, I have about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different bullet points. So just make enough room for that. You can write big, write small, whatever makes sense. But the first one is going to be food. So you're going to write down food, and then you're writing down like protein. So how much protein have you gotten that day? Are you satiated because you're eating balanced meals? Are you frequently eating? And I know you guys are on top of this way more than other people might be, but this is just to kind of like take note of, I guess. Did I eat something that might have affected my mood? And I know Lauren and I have talked about this before, because a lot of clients don't realize it, but some people will respond differently from alcohol or high consumptions of sugar, or some combination of the both, you know? So it's like you have 3 margaritas and the next day you're feeling like super anxious, or some people feel depressed, or who knows what your experience could be, but that's your sign that your body doesn't tolerate that stuff very well. So that's an easy one that Lauren and I discovered before. It was like, wow, I felt kind of anxious and snippy the next day after I drank. I don't know, I forget what else happened, but I think you had like a drink or something. But it was like, oh, it must be the alcohol, because I haven't been drinking alcohol, and that was the only new thing that I had. So we knew, oh, okay, that's what it is. I guess it feels more safe and it feels more in control when you have an idea of where it's coming from. At least that's what I feel like. When I can understand where it's stemming from, I'm like, okay, got it. It's not some like unknown scary thing. It's like, no, this is why it's here. I can choose to drink and experience that emotion, or I can choose like, this isn't for me because I don't like feeling this way, or drinking less or whatever. Hydration. So are you drinking enough water? Because sometimes I've had a client before who I just kept pushing her on water intake, and finally she gave in, and she's like, oh my God, like this week I felt substantially less anxious. And I'm like, I never thought water would impact anxiety, but hey, that's great.
Yeah, right.
Too much caffeine can also cause anxiety. That can be under hydration if you like. The next one would be exercise. So are you doing too little or possibly too much? So if you're not really working out at all, a lot of people don't realize the benefits of exercise and managing anxiety and depression. But doing too much can also impact your hormone balance, and just you're just not recovered. You're kind of dragging. As if you've ever had a rough few days of training, you kind of notice that drop off, and it's kind of like a lull of, oh, I'm doing too much. Medication can also be another one. So are you taking certain medications that might be playing into how you feel? Birth control tends to have a tendency, but I would say it's one of those things that if you can go back, if you're taking birth control, and say, oh yeah, I did start feeling anxious not too long after I got on the pill or whatever, then that's your sign. You want to try to get off of it to see if that would help. Addictive substances. You don't necessarily have to write that down if that's not an issue, but basically anything like caffeine, alcohol, sugar, marijuana. Rest. So are you sleeping enough? Do you feel rested? Have you been doing too much screen time? Sometimes I feel kind of icky after I've been scrolling too long, or if I've been on, collecting social media or the media in general. It's like, oh my God, I can't. I just feel kind of gross. And then the last one for that would be hormones. So are your hormones balanced? Do you experience anxiety during your cycle at any point in time? So maybe that week you're going to get your period, you notice I need more inward time versus external time. Like I get more drained when I'm out and about that week. Or maybe you notice, right when you're going to get your period, anxiety spikes or depression spikes. Who knows? Everyone's experience can be very different. Ideally, you don't experience any of that stuff, and if so, that's something we can work on. But that could be playing a role there too. And let's drop down to cognitive, since that's on my list next. So this is just the need for information. Ultimately, that's all it is. What is true? What is fact? I like to say sometimes, like, what is logical and rational? But in the moment, sometimes who knows what rational is? And how this might look is educating yourself on truth. So if you are trying to think of better examples outside of the ones that, like when I took the course, part of the cognitive truths were about what is love? Like, what is actually realistic? It's not Disney, you know, it's maybe some aspects of Disney, but then it's also a lot of communication, potentially some conflict and navigating all that stuff. You know, because I think a lot of people can have a lot of anxiety about certain things. They don't know, or they don't know what they would classify as normal. So they're worried that they're not normal. And so it's like, how often should we have sex a week? Well, I don't know there's a right answer to that, right? It's just, ultimately it comes down to what feels right for the couple themselves. But I think it gives people some comfort to have an idea of what they think normal is. And so I know she dove into that a little bit, but you know, it's like, hey, that's normal, might not be sex every night, you know, like that might be unrealistic. Normal might not be porn. So, you know, it's just finding and kind of tuning inward to what do I need, what feels right for me, versus externalizing what you think, or really to try to find the answer. And so instead of Googling how much sex should couples have during the week, you're going to find some answer, of course, or multiple different ones, but that doesn't make it wrong or right either. Every couple has their own needs. So when you're trying to figure out in a certain situation, like, is like, what are the facts here? And sometimes you don't know them until you communicate about it. So if both of you kind of have that communication thing, so with people pleasing or dealing with conflict, it's like, so perfect example, when I'm in conflict, I'm hearing what is being said, but I'm taking it probably a little bit more harshly. And so then I start feeling icky or sad or whatever emotion comes up. It's my job to say, is that really what he meant? You know, like, or am I taking it that way? And trying to fact check what's probably reality against just my default pattern of conflict. So when in conflict, this is what I typically do. Well, if I want to change that, because that habit loop kind of sucks, I'm going to have to create a little bit better awareness around what my default pattern is. My default pattern is, I'm in conflict, I feel really uncomfortable, I feel bad about myself, but it also allows me to play victim. It also allows me to say, now you have to make me feel good because you've made me feel bad. And meanwhile, this conflict has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with, you know, something I did wrong, but now you need to apologize to me because that makes me feel in control. Anyone can relate?
Yeah.
And so it's like, if I want to get out of that, because that's not an adult way of, you know, being in conflict, I need to take kind of some awareness around what's going on, fact check it, and show up in a better way, and practice showing up in a better way, which is kind of a side note. But so I guess maybe we can kind of play with this a little bit. can you guys give me some examples in regards to, let's say, or think over certain situations that you've been anxious, whether, Lauren, it's telling someone you don't want to hang out with them, or Kirsten, it's like when you're experiencing conflict or watching conflict, how would you implement the fact checking in those situations? Or what does that possibly look like for you?
I don't know. I feel like for me, it's like I have to start thinking like bigger picture. Like I'm usually thinking like so in the moment and so freaking out instead of just thinking about like if I just take a deep breath, everything will go back to normal and, you know, like life will go on.
So what are your thoughts doing when you're freaking out? Like, what are you thinking, I guess, or what comes up?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like I kind of relate to what you said. Like, I feel like I take everything personally. So, like, everything, it's kind of like, it just seems like my world is all of a sudden becoming like too much to handle, but it's really not.
Okay. So, a thought I just had was love doesn't equal lack of conflict. Right. And I think that's probably a great one, because sometimes I think that to myself too. Just because he's passionately communicating something to me about like something that he doesn't like that I do, does not mean he doesn't love me.
Yeah.
Because sure. I mean, probably my whole life, that's how I felt about conflict, because I'm a 9. It's super uncomfortable. Not that like there was any communication like, you did this thing wrong, we don't love you now, or we love you less. You
right
know? But it feels so much like that. So it's like, as an adult, as your inner parent, which is the intelligent part of yourself, it comes in and says, hey, yes, this is uncomfortable, but you know, you're solving problems, or you're talking through this so you can be stronger from this. Like, just because he has something he wants to say doesn't mean he's disappointed in you, or that he wants to leave you, or that he doesn't love you. And so by knowing where your thoughts go, that helps you guide yourself too. And maybe not in the heat of the moment necessarily, but for sure afterwards, you can definitely do that. The goal would be to get to the point to where you know what your default is, you know where your thoughts go. And so when conflict is happening, you can be there, your inner parent can be there as your inner child is feeling super uncomfortable and whatever else comes up. But the inner parent's like, this is okay, this is safe, he's expressing himself, I can't, you know, like, this is just a conversation, whatever you need to say. But that is a great representation of how you're cognitively, you know, realizing this isn't danger zone. It feels dangerous, but love, or, you know, love doesn't equal zero conflict, as they show you in the movies, you know, like that's bound to happen, unfortunately. And the more you have moments of communication does not mean that your relationship is going down the shitter either. Now, if it's like terrible forms of communication, maybe that's something to work on, but that might be helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Lauren?
I guess probably not assuming that everyone is just going to be upset just because I think they're going to be, but they might not.
And also reminding yourself perhaps that disappointment doesn't kill anyone. And it's okay if I disappoint people, if I'm honoring what feels right for me first. It's not like you're like, I don't really feel like it. It's like, this doesn't feel right in the moment. Like, I just don't want to do this at all. It's a hard no. Then you're honoring yourself. And if you're, I mean, it's way worse to not honor yourself. It's another thing when it's, well, I've committed to it. I don't really feel like going, but it's someone I like. And I convince myself to keep commitments a lot, but not from a place of like, this isn't right for me.
Yeah.
And so disappointment doesn't feel good, but it's going to be okay, and so even if you disappoint somebody, they're not going to stop being your friend over it. And so reminding yourself of that stuff, reminding yourself of times when you've perhaps been disappointed by somebody, even your husband, but yet you still love them.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
this is just part of relationships. Like, this is how it goes. Like, you're going to disappoint somebody, they're going to disappoint you, but reminding yourself that disappointment doesn't equal unlovable or a lack of love in general.
Right.
I guess that's good enough for cognition anyway. I always like to think, what's really happening here? What's the logical part of this? But the next one, emotional, I like to think of this one as your inner child. So a couple things can go under this one. You can write down like questions to ask, basically questions to ask yourself. Where was I hurt? When did I learn that I'm blank? So whether that's, when did I learn that I'm not enough, that I don't matter, that I'm not important, whatever feels right for you is probably, you can write a couple down, but we tend to go to the same stories, or the same core wounding, if you will. A lot of people have the not enough. Some people have I'm not good enough. Like, and their thing is they're always striving to be a good person or to do good. And I think sometimes you can see what your wounding is when you're being triggered by something. So I just remember, like, I don't speak up a lot, so I'm pretty quiet when I'm not coaching. But what irritates the shit out of me more than anything else, well, maybe one of the things, but is when people speak over me, or when I'm talking to somebody and somebody barges into the conversation and takes over the conversation. Like, it makes me boil, and I'm not a boiler. But I had this happen to me very distinctly with somebody, I think it was last year or so. And I remember thinking, why is this so irritating? Like, I thought my face was red, how mad it got me right off the bat. And I listened to myself say, how you like get mad about something and you're like, all right, just go and talk over me. No big deal. I wasn't talking here. I guess it doesn't matter what I have to say. Not that important to you. And I'm like, oh, that's where it's coming from. And so that is sometimes how you get to where you're kind of, the flashlight on the wounding aspect is like, where do your thoughts spiral to? And
Right.
so when people talk over me, it's like, I guess it doesn't matter what I have to say. So it's like, either I'm not that important or I don't matter. And so sometimes it's helpful, I think, to know what your thought patterns are, because then you can correct them. And so when you're spiraling and saying, I don't matter, it's okay to be pissed about the event, but you want to correct the negative self-belief, if that makes sense. So instead of saying, I'm not enough, I don't matter, I'm unlovable, it's fact checking that. It's like, okay, clearly this was from a traumatic experience at some point in my life as a kid, but is it true? Am I really unlovable? Like, how many people love me? Like, okay, well, clearly that's not a fact. It takes time to switch the belief. And I think you might always be somewhat triggered, but instantly why you're triggered, because you're like, that unlovable thing is coming up for me right now. But because you have the awareness, you can choose to act differently. Versus sometimes when you're triggered and you have no clue, you react, and maybe not the best way, and it depends on who you are. Kirsten, I don't know about you, but like shutting down and getting silent is my go-to thing. Is
Yeah,
that yours?
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like you're not talking to anyone right now. Like I have literally mentally given you the middle finger or the hand. Like, you're talking too much. I'm gone. I don't care anymore, because this is my safety way of dealing with what is going on outside.
Yeah.
And I don't remember where I was going with that sentence, but so when I'm internal though, my credit card was in my hand, not sure why. I'm thinking, what am I feeling? Why am I being triggered by this conversation right now? What about it is making me feel really uncomfortable? And that's when you dig into where it's coming from. And it's, oh, because I'm feeling this. Okay, well, that's great. Now I know why. But when you're thinking about where it's coming from, you're creating that space between trigger and reaction. And so when I'm there, yes, I'm like kind of slowly shutting down, but I'm also fighting it simultaneously, because I know I don't need to do that anymore. And I want to show up differently in conflict. So I'm like, okay, let's like be engaged facially here. So I talk myself through conflict a lot of the time, because I'm usually not the one talking, but I'm trying to look engaged, not take it personally. And I'm almost coaching myself through what's really uncomfortable typically. And so let's say, Lauren, you get a text from somebody and instantly you're like, oh my God, I don't want to do this at all. And I know you can remember a conversation that we've had about something like this.
Literally.
Yeah. And you're like, you're instantly triggered. And it's like, okay, I'm feeling super anxious and uncomfortable about this. Where is it coming from? Why do I feel this way? And I think yours, I feel like twos typically come from an unlovable place, but I don't know if that sounds true for you, or if you have another one that sounds more accurate.
I don't know. I feel like I need to dig deeper now listening to you say all these things. So I'm not sure.
Okay. I didn't realize the time, but we've got time. Yeah, so like next time you're feeling that way, kind of, and you could journal about it. Sometimes journaling is easier because you're slowing your thoughts down. So it's like, you ever think through a problem, you're like, I thought for hours on this, I journal about it, and all of a sudden I have these enlightened moments because I finally slow my ass down a little bit to like think and like let it flow out. So that could be helpful. And also, if you can tie certain conversations or feelings together. So for example, like, oh, this isn't the first time I felt this fiery about something, or this hurt about something. Let me refer back to when this has happened more recently, or last year or 2 years ago. What's the common theme? What am I feeling in both of these situations, especially if the sensation is the same? Like I said, when in conflict, I do not feel the same as when someone talks over me. Like, I'm ready to beat people up when people talk over me. It's like I actually get outward, and I don't know why. When I'm in conflict, it's different because I'm taking it personal, and so I'm like more of like a wounded animal, if you will. So completely different reactions, but they're coming from two different places too, most likely, or two different stories. And so each time I'm like, okay, tapping into, where's this coming from? What's going on? Couple things as well you can write down. Oh, I didn't finish that. Wow, that took a while. So where was I hurt? You wrote down. When did I learn that I'm not enough, or whatever? What am I most afraid of? So whether it's losing a friend, being left, or and then what is needed right now? which is a lot of what I talk about. Like, what do you need in this moment? Other things, 3 other things to write down under that would be, I guess this one could come next, but current emotional pain. So you're in the pain. What do I need right now? Have I released my emotions lately? So sometimes if you don't do anything with your emotions, they just kind of build up till all of a sudden they're like too much to handle. And then that's when I usually recommend crying to release them, or sometimes punching pillows. Kirsten, you probably aren't a puncher. Like I am, like, I don't have that much anger. Like I just don't feel the emotion very much.
Yeah, exactly.
But crying works great.
Yeah.
And then I always ask, like, what does your inner child need? Do they need comforted? Do they need compassion? Whatever. And then 2 big pieces sometimes for people, for the fear. So when I asked you, like, what am I most afraid of? Like, a lot of people are afraid of a couple of things, but fear of loss is the big one, especially I feel like that's really popular right now. But loss of, of anything, people, events, but also loss of self. So if you feel like you could be swallowed whole because you're giving too much of yourself away. So that is pretty common with a lack of boundaries. So if you aren't setting boundaries, or if you don't have a very good, I notice this if I'm having a lack of, or I don't deserve something mentality, I will feel like I'll lose myself. And so it's something that I keep my eye on, is like, okay, I deserve to do this, and it's okay if I want to do it. Because at one point in my life, I had a lot of that, and I didn't think it was okay, or I had to earn something, especially when I'm in a relationship. It changes for whatever reason, because I have someone to be accountable to, I guess. But that's just one way. Loss of other. So some people have a lot of anxiety because they're afraid of losing that person. Or a huge one for probably most of us, loss of control and uncertainty in general. The other one is a fear of death, whether that is a fear of aging, a fear of impermanence, a lack of aliveness. So just like, if that's like super uncomfortable, it's like feeling kind of dead inside. Fear of the unknown can also go there. Emptiness or loneliness, or a fear of big feelings. Like sometimes it feels like it's too much, like something bad might happen. You might die because it's too much, or you might not be able to get out of it. And then the last circle is spiritual. So questions to ask yourself: how do I fill my spiritual / creative well? So imagine there's a soulful well inside of you, and you fill it with all things that make you feel, I don't know, joyous comes to mind. But ultimately, you can ask yourself, am I spending enough time in nature, in mindfulness, in my dream life? So having imagination or being creative. And creative expression, you can write down, that can be a way to tap into or fill your spiritual well, would be dancing, writing, painting, singing, anything, like being artistic in any type of way. Nature, so it allows you to get grounded, allows your soul to like connect with nature into a higher power, if you will, and reconnect with your inner knowing and peace. So I always find that to be really true. It's like I can be all in my head, but then if I go for a walk in the woods, I have that calming sense of like, I truly do know what the answer is. I just need to get myself calm enough to come to the realization. And then spirit is another one. So connecting to something bigger than yourself, whether that's God, universe, your inner wise self. And then the last one is healthy rituals. So that those help us to anchor us into time and space. What rituals could look like? Honestly, the standard ritual I have is I work out 5 times a week. Outside of that, I don't have any other set rituals, but I know a lot of people who do meditate every day, journal every day. It's something I'm always pulling back in. It's just not something that is a steady ritual currently, but those are all different options. And maybe a ritual can even be drinking a cup of water every morning before you have your coffee. Like, could be anything, but it's something you commit to. It's something you follow through on. So what you would use that circle for is kind of to back ourselves out, is to take inventory when you're feeling anxious, going into the different realms and thinking, okay, what's going on here? What is this alerting me to? Like, is something off physically? And if you're like, nope, check, that's all good. Okay, is this alerting me to something I need to do from an emotional standpoint? Like, have I just not dealt with my emotions lately? Or am I being triggered by something? Do I need to fact check something? Am I being, I always say irrational, but in a way, like, am I being really, off the, I forget the word I'm looking for, reservation with my thoughts? Like, is this really far out there? Can I rein it back into what's actually true? Or spiritual, like sometimes I feel anxious when I'm not taking enough initiative, or if I'm not living up into what I think my potential feels like. And that can cause me a lot of anxiety. It took me a while to figure out where that one was coming from, but it's just kind of interesting how feelings can alert you to things that you might not even think about. But if you sit with it long enough and you journal about it and get curious, a lot of the time you can see where it's coming from. I had way more written down in here, but we might have to do a part 2 at some point. That would be fine.
I would like a part 2, yeah.
Yeah, me too.
I'll do it for you guys.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. Yeah. What did you learn? What did you like? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I typically just don't like deal with or like confront like the issue at hand, even if I like sometimes I like don't even let myself realize that I'm getting anxious, or like I'm trying to like outwardly project it onto other things, but I've never really considered like stopping in the middle of my thoughts and thinking like, why am I feeling like this? So it's definitely a good perspective to carry through.
Well, and especially because your actions are.
Yeah.
As soon as you go cleaning, you're like, okay, something's off. I mean, it's a great habit, I guess.
Right. But still, I mean, it's like so easy to pinpoint. So it's like I could easily just like catch it right there.
Yeah. I mean, a clean house is great, but it's like, if it's not making you feel better and you're just like having all this anxious energy and like expelling it everywhere, it's like, oh man, if you could check in and kind of get a little bit more clarity on what's going on and finding those things that help you move through that emotion a little bit better, then you'd be cleaning because you enjoy it or because you just like a nice house. Well, what about you?
I guess I kind of feel the same way, because I don't take the time to, Like even for example, like last week when I texted you and I was super anxious because we were getting like an appraisal done of our house, and you like gave me these great suggestions to like go into nature and relax, and I told myself I didn't have the time to do it because it would take away from me cleaning. Like, who am I? Like, I'm like, I just have to get it done. So definitely, I agree. I need to like sit back and, I don't know, like realize where it's coming from instead of just giving in and cleaning frantically and letting it take me over.
Yeah. I mean, because there's a definite difference between I need to clean because let's say you're having people over or something. Like, yes, everyone should tidy up for their guests. But if it's coming from a place of like, in the sensation wise, like you're up here and you're like, oh my God, I got so much to do. I got to clean all this stuff. That's when you know I can afford to take 20 minutes to myself because I don't want to spend the next several hours like this because you will. And it's never going to be enough versus taking the time to calm yourself back down enough to realize like, okay, what actually needs to be done here? And then you do what needs to be done in a more healthy manner and you feel a lot better about it afterwards.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, the point of checking in. I only do this because it's so uncomfortable to feel these types of emotions for me that I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? How do I get out of here? How do I solve it? And so it's like practicing, not trying to exit stage left when I feel really uncomfortable and realizing that like, just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean anything's wrong either. It's like, it's okay to feel something and not do anything about it too. And so, usually I try to do something about it. And if I can't problem solve my way or cope my way through something, it's like, well, guess this is here to stay for a while. Might as well just like deal with it.
Right.
But yeah, I think getting curious about it and trying to do what you can does typically help mitigate it. And then, whatever's left over, eventually it goes away. Everything always it's like the ocean. It's like in and out.